Welcome everybody to the greatest show on YouTube, Three Black Heathen Show. Today with me, Drag, and Nate Brody. We have two special guests in the house. I'm going to go and introduce these two guys. Right now we have my man, Bert Poole, and we have the great Ozzy. Ozzy Mendez. Today we're going to talk about a particular, philosophical argument that been going on in the community, I guess, for a few years now, basically. I know y'all see Steve McRae's face on the picture on our pic, and this is not a personal attack, so we want to just let everybody know that, because we know this all. We want to make sure this is not some type of personal attack or something of the past that y'all think might be going on with Steve and Nate. It's not that at all. We actually have these friendly discussions and debates on Steve's page, a lot on Facebook and so forth. So we basically want to talk about how Steve used his term as far as agnosticism and atheism, as far as him claiming it to be the way he used it, and the way SCP. We're going to be basically using standard encyclopedia, Stanford's encyclopedia of philosophy. We're going to be using more than that, but this is the one that he basically uses. Steve used this particular encyclopedia, but we're basically going to be talking about how he uses his way of agnosticism, and how he uses his term, and how he defines it, and how he defines atheism. So this is going to be a particular topic, a particular great topic. Like, once again, we're not attacking anybody, and anybody from the chats, after everything is said and done, y'all can come in. I'm sure we're going to have a big after show. I'm sure it's going to be wonderful. So we got these professional panelists, like I say, Ozzy and Bert. They come in anytime they want and can speak on this particular subject. So this is what I'm going to do right now. And listen. Oh, and by the way, everybody that's in the chat right now, I want you to go on and hit the like button. Even if you don't like us, we don't really care. We like you. So I want you to go ahead and hit the like button right now. And I also want you to go tell everybody that we're on right now and what we're talking about, spread the word. So this is what I'm going to do. Since this was basically, I guess I won't say it's just Nate's idea. It's me and Nate's idea.
No, you actually found it out when I spoke to you. You had found it out before I did. And I was like, oh, right. Shit, you already recognized.
So I want to just hand it over to Nate first, and so he can explain why we're doing this show. What is the show about? What is our position? So everybody can understand exactly where we're coming from. So Nate, I know Nate we have clips to play.
Yes.
Blah 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 blah. So I'm going to go and hand it over to Nate so he can go and explain what the hell we're talking about today and where we're going with this. Okay, Nate.
All right. So tonight we're going to examine Steve McRae's logic and conclusions for this ongoing atheist versus agnostic debate. And I'm going to, just for full disclosure, my position has honestly changed based on the research that we've encountered.
So Steve was right the whole time. You did all that damn argument only to say he was fucking right.
No, but to be honest with you,
tell me.
I want to say something. Part of his argument was correct, and my argument has changed based on actually reading what Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says. It's more in line with, I think, what now you and Emperor says. I've had to stop fighting it, but I am more aligned. But we'll explain that why. We'll get into that. And I know that's a shocker, but my position has evolved. So this is, again, Empress said it best. This is not a personal attack on Steve, but a response to his position that we feel have some contradictions and stands on some questionable logic. So that's what we're going to be really examining. Now, first, we're going to show our evidence. What we believe would help everyone come to the same conclusion that we've come to, that the argument that Steve has put forward is logically flawed. And it kind of goes something like this. First, this is how we're going to accomplish this goal. First, we're going to hear some clips of Steve laying out his argument, laying out the various positions that he's been holding, and the argument why atheism particularly should be defined as a proposition. Second, we're going to look at his sources and test whether his argument makes sense based on those sources. So we're going to look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and we're going to look how they define atheists, and we're going to look at the understanding on why they define atheism that way. Then we're going to look at agnosticism and see how they define agnosticism and the logic on why they define agnosticism that way. And then we'll see if Steve's position is in line with the philosophical view of the source that he cites, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So first, let me play the clips to allow Steve, because I don't want to especially since we all have it on video, it's best if I just let Steve explain his argument the way he understands it, and then we'll go into what actually is going on with SEP. So the next clip you'll hear is actually Steve McRae explaining what it means to be agnostic. His argument, what it means to be agnostic, and his conclusion.
So my argument is this. There are different ways to define atheism. Again, I'm going to give you this as simple premises. There's different ways to define atheism. Colloquially, atheism can be you don't have a God belief. So anybody who doesn't have a God belief is an atheist. Or you can define it more philosophically, which is the belief that gods don't exist. Either way, you're an atheist, right? I've never said you're not an atheist if you hold to the colloquial definition. My argument is that since I don't hold to colloquial definitions, don't label me by them. Just like a theist should not label you that you're a theist because they hold to Romans 1, right? So if you want to, if you know, in your own discourse of conversation, if you want to say, hey, you know what, I'm talking to Steve, he's that atheist over Steve, or, you know, whatever, you know, I'm not going to stop you from doing that, right? You know, I'm not going to be that pedantic. But if you're talking to me and you're saying, hey, Steve, you're an atheist, at that point, we're not going to have a conversation because you're labeling me something that I'm not, according to philosophical definitions, which I hold to. And I don't think it's appropriate for people to label somebody in a conversation, especially when we have these types of conversations, because I could put forth my own position. I don't need you to tell me what my position is.
Now we all have agreement with. Now we all have agreement that, you know, people should define their own positions. That's true, but what we're now talking about is whether Steve's understanding of the colloquial definition versus the philosophical definition is something that holds up. So now we're going to look at Steve actually define what it means to be agnostic.
Like, I'm not gonna lie, and this might seem a little ranty, but I'm slowly getting to the point with the atheist versus agnosticism conversation that I kind of want to do the same thing with it that I do with like young Earth creationists, where I'm just like, here's the cited literature. Do you have a counter? No? Okay, I'm glad the conversation's over.
I've done that. No, I have.
I'm just gonna fucking start linking the SEP and just be like, here's 30 pages to read through at minimum. When you're done, because I've already suffered through this inane bullshit myself, have fun.
Well, when they cite something, it's the dictionary, right? And I had this happen God knows how many times.
The dictionary is descriptive, not prescriptive. Therefore, it's not usable as a defense mechanism.
Yeah, I'll cite, you know, philosophical sources, philosophical encyclopedias, SEP, IEP, all that kind of crap. Everything that like Shannon Q hates, I'll cite just to piss her off. Love you, Shannon.
Why does Shannon not like it?
Because she knows it is true.
She finds philosophy inane, but she doesn't have a good argument against it.
Not necessarily. No, she knows that we're right. I mean, she's not a dumb woman. She's very intelligent.
Well, that doesn't stop it from being inane.
Could be. Yeah.
I like philosophy, and I find it inane.
Sure, have a debate with Shannon now about this topic.
I got banned from the atheist experience for saying agnosticism is a belief position.
Yeah, let me articulate my position out first, because everybody seems to straw man a lot. Well, you guys don't, but a lot of people straw man my position. Okay, and the way Dr. Graham Oppie explains it is the same way that I am. Okay, so the agnosticism is basically the belief position that you are not justified to assign a truth value to the proposition of theisms. So you suspend judgment on it. So you look at it, you can't evaluate it properly, and you say, I'm suspending judgment on it. So you're neither a theist nor you're an atheist.
So I just want to make it very clear. Steve has said that he's defining agnosticism as a belief position, and it's a suspend judgment belief position. So agnosticism is a belief position, and let's understand the first clip where Steve is now saying that he only holds the philosophical definitions, and there's a rejection of colloquial definitions. And just to be clear, Steve's source for this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now, sometimes we would even look toward the I think it's called IEP, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But the problem
Right.
is that the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy also references back to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy when it's talking about these terms. So since they're both talking about the same thing, we're going to reference it. So I just want to be very clear. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy doesn't have the term colloquial atheism or philosophical atheism. It has an understanding of what they are. So that's the first thing we have to understand. What does SEP actually say? So SEP goes into, when you talk about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it first starts off with atheism, defining it as a proposition. And it explains to us why is that useful for it to be understood as a proposition. The proposition that the belief that God exists versus the psychological state of belief of the lack of belief position, the lack belief in a God. Now, SEP also states that while identifying atheism as a metaphysical claim that there is no God, the word is polysemous, and it has more than one related meaning, even within philosophy.
Right.
But SEP also makes mention that when you're using these terms in philosophy, it's better to understand them in the propositional context because that's what can be tested. You can't really test someone's psychological state of belief, but you can test the
And
proposition.
just as a point of clarification, does Steve claim that he does not use the psychological state of belief? Has he claimed that?
No. Remember the clip that we just showed. He clearly claims that he's using agnosticism as a belief position, the lack of belief in atheism, the lack of belief.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
what Steve's position is, and that's what he's saying here. It's the middle ground. So understanding how atheism is described in the Stanford, and again, don't take our word for it. Go look for yourself. Read it for yourself. It introduces the concept, it introduces the duality of the word, and then states that we're going to only use it in a propositional context because of this understanding. So then, and I have to give credit to both Emperor Atheist and Barney. Barney, we know you're out there. We then looked up agnosticism and then said, well, how does the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy deal with agnosticism? So what it does, it first starts off with a history of agnosticism, the Huxleyan agnosticism, and understands that there's a difference between the propositions and the conclusions of Huxley's argument. And it states the conclusions of Huxley's argument are really a knowledge claim. It's not about beliefs. Steve earlier said that you have to understand the belief, but that's not what SEP actually says. SEP then introduces us to the difference between agnosticism as a belief claim and agnosticism as a knowledge claim. First, it says agnosticism as a belief claim is the psychological sense of the word. Then it introduces us to agnosticism as a proposition. And that proposition is that neither theism or atheism is known to be true, a knowledge claim. Now, there's a stark difference between the two because SEP actually posits that you could be an agnostic atheist or agnostic theist. So when both of these terms after it goes through describing what agnosticism is as a psychological state of belief, then it describes agnosticism as a proposition. SEP then starts making an argument for one version over the other. Similarly, the same thing I did with atheism. So first it talks about the ism on the back of words, and it says that typically when you see ism in philosophy, that typically stands for the proposition.
Right.
And it says, quote, since only they can be sensibly tested by argument. So that's why it's better to use propositions within philosophy. Then SEP concludes, because now since they've introduced us to both of these words, then they conclude, no doubt that both senses of agnosticism in the psychological state and the epistemological state will continue to be used both inside and outside of philosophy. Hopefully the context will be distinguishable. In the remainder of SEP, so this was after the introduction of the word, SEP then goes on to say in the remainder of the entry that agnosticism will only be used as a proposition in the epistemological sense. Right. So the whole paper, from that point where they introduced the dichotomy between both the psychological state of belief and the proposition, the rest of the paper only uses it as a proposition. So Steve has built this argument for the past 3 years, and he said that atheism is a proposition, and look at Sepp. Sepp tells us, and he's right. It does tell us to use it in this particular form because it's better for use in philosophy. But it doesn't seem like he's read what Sepp said about agnosticism, because it does the same thing with agnosticism, and then uses agnosticism in that particular form. Go ahead.
Hey, now I didn't interrupt you. Can we screen share so people can see exactly where we're coming from? Can you?
Sure, I'll screen share. I'll screen share because it is really, really heavy. But I'll screen share
some of it. Can you? Yeah,
course,
I mean, I know this ain't. I know this. I don't think Zoom works like Google Hangout, but I know. No, Google Hangout, we can just like share everything. And,
no, but I'll share. I'll share some of the main points. Okay, so hold on. Let me. I'm going to screen share this. Give me 1 second.
To see exactly what we're talking about here as we begin to have this conversation, because mind you here, while Nate gets that set up, we're going to kind of expound into, well, even though these terms are polysemous, when we're talking to our parents, particularly some of our mothers, and they understand the psychological state of belief as opposed to a proposition. Not many people outside of those who have some familiarity with philosophical propositions, syllogisms, what have you, talk about this. It's, in most common parlance, the psychological state. So if we're going to talk about having one versus the other, should we all shift our language towards a propositional version? Should we all try and be philosophers in our own respect, or should we kind of stick to what we've been doing and then just supply the context as needed, depending on our audience? So we will be discussing that later in the Hangout, folks. And by the way, if you download the Zoom app, you too can join in on this conversation, because we definitely want people to come in and challenge our ideas. This is by no means is just some edict by the three black heathens and the two associated fairly black heathens. So
it's an edict. It's an edict because I'm the emperor. I said it. I meant it. Damn it. No.
So first, hold on. So first, let me just point to, here is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and this is the definition of agnosticism, and here, just going back to where it talks about ism. Further, as suggested earlier, it is for good reason, typically in philosophy, to use the suffix ism to refer as a proposition instead of the state or condition, since only the former can sensibly be tested by argument. And then at the bottom here, we'll go to where it says, in this paper, in this entry, they're only going to use it in this propositional sense. Sorry, just let me make sure I can get that piece. Damn, this thing is so dense, and it's funny because I've read this thing so many times, and I don't know why I didn't see this before until actually Barney said something, and then when you said something up, I was like, oh, you know what, you guys are right.
Yeah, we were.
All right, here it is. It says, in the remainder of this entry, however, the term agnosticism will be used in its epistemological sense. This makes a huge difference to the issue of justification. And then it says consider. So in the rest of this article, after it just says here, after it just explains to you the two differences and why they're different and which one is better and which state is better, then it says from the rest of this paper, we're going to use it in this particular sense, not as a psychological state of belief, but in epistemological sense, which you'll see. Again, read the article for yourself. Don't believe us. Read the article for yourself. It is as a proposition. So if that's the case, and if Steve's whole argument is built on this framework that we can only use philosophical terms, then he's a colloquial agnostic, it seems like. And philosophically, he would be, actually, he would be, I'm not sure what his position would be philosophically, but it wouldn't be agnostic, because agnostic would be a knowledge claim versus a belief claim, which I think would be the colloquial version, if this logic is to hold true. What do you guys think?
Okay, you know what? This is a good thing. And I want Ozzy, because me and Ozzy were just talking about this. You might as well go and unmute yourself, Ozzy, because I want to ask you something. We were just talking about this, and we were talking about the knowability which SCP says, and Ozzy, this is why I'm glad. I actually want to hear Ozzy. I want everybody to hear what Ozzy got to say on this, because me and Ozzy kind of different on this a little bit. Ozzy actually says that agnosticism is really not much about knowing, but it's about, he explained it in a different view. But this is what I want to say, Ozzy, as far as this particular question, Ozzy, and Ozzy just said that we should explain the proposition of agnosticism. So what is the proposition of agnosticism? Now, according to SCP, if you use, particularly when matter of fact, Nate, can you go up on the same page you were just on? Go up to the front part. Actually, when it comes right down below, and it explains it perfectly what the proposition of agnosticism. I can't find the page right now, but if you go right below the part when it started talking about Huxley, it explains. It explains the position of agnosticism as a proposition. And it says,
however, if agnosticism is defined as a proposition, then agnostic must be defined in terms of agnosticism instead of the other way around. Specifically, agnostic must be defined as the person who believes that the proposition agnosticism is true, instead of agnosticism being defined as a state of being an agnostic. If the proposition in question is that neither theism or atheism is known to be true, then the term agnostic can no longer serve as a label for those who are neither theist nor atheist, since one can consistently believe that atheism or theism is true while denying atheism or theism is known to be true. So this is saying that you could actually be an agnostic theist or an agnostic atheist if we're holding agnosticism as a proposition. Go ahead, Ozzy.
Sure. I'm a little uncomfortable trying to characterize Steve's position here, because I'm not entirely familiar with his views on this. I'm familiar with his views on atheism and how he defines it. He and I see eye to eye on that. We might differ a little bit on the question of agnosticism, although I think we're quite similar. So for my own case, I think that agnosticism has to be understood as a middle position, not really about knowledge, but as withholding one's assent to the proposition that God exists and withholding one's assent to the proposition that God doesn't exist. If you talk to people who go around calling themselves agnostics, they will invariably tell you, no, I'm not a theist, and no, I'm not an atheist either. Now, why do they repudiate both terms? It's because by their lights, given their understanding of the issues and the arguments for and against, they think that one can't come to a rational conclusion one way or the other. At least they themselves cannot come to a conclusion. They feel that they can't reasonably and justifiably affirm that God exists, nor do they feel that they can reasonably and justifiably affirm the non-existence of a God. Right? So they find themselves not in a situation of merely lacking knowledge. I mean, I'm an atheist. I think no gods exist. I think they're all made up. I think they're all fictions. They're all imaginary. They're all BS. Okay, I'm about as atheistic as they come. Okay, but I don't know to a certitude that any and every conceivable deity can't exist. I don't know that all these deities are impossibilities. Some of them I think are impossibilities. Some of them are contradictory. But I don't know that they're all impossibilities. So I'm not an atheist because I can prove that every God is an impossibility. I just think that they're very likely to be false. All right. So I think I have good reasons for thinking that all these religions are made up and all of the positive gods that have been put forward are fictions, just like I think that there are good reasons for thinking that Bigfoot is a fiction, even though I can't prove that Bigfoot is an impossibility. Bigfoot's not a logical impossibility, okay? So a lot of agnostics are of the view that they cannot affirm reasonably, as I think I can, that gods don't exist. And they don't think that they can affirm reasonably that a God does exist. So they're on the fence, okay? Now that's a real answer to a question, right? And so what they find themselves in a position of lacking a belief in a God, and they lack a belief in the non-existence of a God, right? That is truly a middle position. Now you can disagree with agnostics about whether or not that middle position is rational or not, but it is in fact a position that people occupy. Mm-hmm. And if they don't think that they have a good reason to occupy the positive or the negative position, then where they are is exactly where they should be. in a state of indecision or inconclusiveness. So the way I think that that we ought to understand agnostics and how they typically understand themselves is that agnosticism is a middle position because it's a position of inconclusiveness, right? They're just indecisive. They're undecided. They're inconclusive. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
But no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You had something to say, Nate?
Yeah, I was just going to say I agree with Ozzy, but what you're describing, and I think most eloquently, is the psychological state of agnosticism.
Right.
Most people hold, and I can take exactly what you've just said and turn agnosticism and say atheist, and then say the same exact things. Most atheists agree that there's a lack belief position. It's this middle ground, even though there's a philosophical or propositional understanding versus a colloquial understanding. And the colloquial understanding, I think most agnostics would say, I'm this middle position, and colloquially most atheists would say they're this middle position. But the argument about the philosophical sense of the word is what we're talking about. And SEP,
I can do that. I can address that if you like.
Okay, but I'm just saying the SEP, IEP, Oxford, all that make it very clear that the propositional sense is the one that's used in philosophy, not the psychological state of belief.
Exactly.
So so what I was describing was the psychological state of lacking a belief that a God exists and lacking a belief that a God doesn't exist. That's the psychological sense. Okay. The propositional sense is when a person who self-identifies as an agnostic identifies it because they believe a certain proposition. Okay. Well, what might the proposition be? Well, there are two. One is sometimes called the Huxleyan position. Okay. And it depends on how you read Huxley, because people disagree on what Huxley's position was, because it's unclear from his famous essay what he meant. And there are some letters that he wrote that muddy the waters even further. But what is sometimes called the Huxleyan position, and it is a position, is the following. The question of God's existence is absolutely inscrutable. We cannot answer it. It is unanswerable by anyone ever in principle. It's just, it's metaphysical. It's beyond our ken. We will never be able to understand it. No one's in a position to understand this. And so no one has any business affirming theism as true or affirming atheism, the negation of theism, as true either. Right? So on the Huxleyan view, nobody has any rational warrant for being a theist or an atheist. Now that's a claim. That is a claim about the state of the evidence. That's not a claim that a God exists or doesn't exist. That's a claim about the state of the discourse, and that nobody should ever affirm theism or atheism, and that theists and atheists are effectively being irrational in affirming either the positive or the negative position. Okay, so that's one proposition. Another proposition is a more modest one, and it's this one, and it's closer to the psychological state. It maps onto the psychological state that I described earlier. Imagine a person who says, look, I have considered the arguments for and against God. Some of them, okay, I kind of see some of the design arguments. They make a certain amount of sense, but there's a lot of defeaters that I can think of for those arguments. That some of the premises are a little dubious, and I can think of good arguments against God's existence. All of the wish fulfillment and wishful thinking that goes into religious belief and stuff like that, and how it lines up with certain cognitive biases and a disposition to read pattern and meaning into nature and stuff like that. I can understand why people would believe these fictitious things, and those are good reasons for doubting any religious claims or any talk about gods. So I can think of good reasons for thinking gods don't exist, but there's problems with those arguments. They're not conclusive either. So you get some agnostics who say, look, I've considered some of the arguments for and against, and they are just inconclusive. Those people aren't saying that nobody could ever know. They're not saying that God is to be understood as something that could never be known with any confidence or be disproven with any confidence. They're just saying, given the present state of the evidence as I understand it, I can't reach a conclusion, right? It would be irrational for me, given my understanding of the arguments for and against, to affirm theism or atheism, and therefore I'm an agnostic. So that would be another positive assertion, but again, it's a metaclaim. It's an assertion about the state of the evidence as they understand it. So the strong Huxleyan position is a positive claim, but it's a claim not about whether a God exists or not, but about whether or not anyone could ever be rationally warranted. And it says that nobody could ever be rationally warranted. The weaker agnostic position, the fence sitter position, is one that affirms that, no, well, I for myself simply cannot affirm that God exists or that God doesn't exist, given the state of evidence. That could change, right? This is what I think this is close to what Steve McRae believes. Actually, he describes himself as a temporal agnostic. That is, at the present moment, at the present time, temporally. I'm on the fence. I can't make up my mind. I can see arguments for, I can see arguments against. I can defeat the arguments for, I can defeat the arguments against. I just am in a position of indecision or inconclusiveness. That too is a positive claim, actually. But again, it's not a claim about whether or not God exists. It's a claim about the state of the evidence.
But I would rebut with this. Two points. I think, again, if for atheists, for those atheists who say they lack belief in a God, I would make the same argument to say that this is somebody who's evaluated the evidence. I just lack belief in that particular claim, and I think you could say the same for agnostic. But we'd also have to share the opinion that those are psychological states of belief, which I think we'd both agree with, and that's what the literature is saying. But I believe as a proposition, the difference between this knowledge claim as a proposition and a knowledge claim and a belief claim is that I believe using agnosticism as a knowledge claim kind of subsumes, it's the belief claim is subsumed within it. For instance, you can, if a person says they lack belief in God and lack belief gods don't exist, they are agnostic. They are saying that they have no knowledge of the claim. That's essentially what they're saying. It's almost identical. But you can also have an agnostic, somebody who is agnostic, who can believe a God exists, but say, well, we don't know that that's to be true. That's also a different version of agnosticism. And then you can have the third version of agnosticism, where you can have an atheist who's agnostic, who says, hey, I believe gods don't exist, but I just don't know. So those three versions of agnosticism are under this umbrella of the proposition of agnosticism, and that's why it seems like that's why it seems like Sepp is making the distinction between this psychological state of belief and the proposition, because the proposition is something that, again, Sepp says is the only thing that can sensibly be tested. Go ahead, Brett. I'm Brett, sorry.
No, it's fine. I really like the gumball analogy with the even or odds, how many gumballs are in the jar. And I think what with respect to the notion of burdens, I think what the agnostic is saying is that they lack a procedure by which to determine how many, whether it's even or an odd number in the jar. They see no way of arriving at an answer. They lack the means currently and haven't been presented them any convincing means. And I think the burden they have on it is that when there's a theist or there's an atheist who is presenting what they believe are the means, there is a burden on the agnostic to demonstrate why that is false, why that doesn't hold water, essentially. And I might come to Ozzy or I might come to Nate and say, well, what do you mean you don't know whether it's an even or an odd number? It's an even number. Here's why. And when I present here's why, I am now justifying my reasons for thinking I can conclude the matter. And the agnostic who wants to disagree with me takes on the burden at that point, where they then have to demonstrate how that falls flat. And they might go ahead and do that, return to an agnostic position. But I think it's valid that there's, well, I guess I'm not quite sure what the beef is between the psychological state that where you neither hold a belief that it's even nor hold a belief that it's odd, and that state that you are in describes your agnosticism, compared to the propositional form of rendering your position as well, I guess it would be in the affirmative that you lack the means by which to render the case. I'm not sure what the exact beef is with Steve.
Maybe. Oh, go ahead, Drag.
Let me put it this way. How does it factor into his argument that he's presenting, I guess? How is it a flaw in the argument?
Right. So that seems to be the contention here. And by the way, we're trying our best to capture exactly what Steve's argument is. We have the screenshots as well as the timestamps from the videos where he's described it. No one's said that he's anything other than agnostic, but for Steve, his preference is to be labeled using philosophical terms. Granted, that's perfectly acceptable. But his contention when people are using these labels is that he wants them to remain as philosophically sound as possible and to be as philosophically rigorous as it can be. So that's his choice. So he sees other people not using these terms in that particular manner, the philosophically rigorous version, which is the propositional version, even though when he describes his position, it's not the one that's prescribed by the source that he uses, which his source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, says that the psychological state of belief is not one that should be used, but instead the propositional version should be used.
When you say Steve's argument, what is the conclusion of his argument? Is it that what is the conclusion of his argument? I guess we could start there.
Let me expand, because I think I can understand. First, you asked two questions, and I want to just take them both separately because I think it'll answer the question about what the beef is. The first question was that the difference, more or less you're asking what's the difference between the propositional sense of agnosticism and the psychological state of belief, right?
So I've got that, right? It's more of how is Steve then? It seems like you're suggesting that he's doing a little bit of a bait and switch with terms.
Yes.
And what is the argument at the root of this and the conclusion?
All right. The argument is that Steve's argument, as he said earlier, was that atheism should be best defined as a proposition. And because of this source, defines it as a proposition and explains why they define atheism as a proposition, which I agree with. Then Steve on the back end says that he's not, but then as he concludes that he rejects all non-philosophical definitions, all colloquial definitions he rejects, and only wants to be known and identified with philosophical definitions. But then on the back end, when you apply that same logic to his position of agnosticism, then he holds the psychological state of belief, which is not the philosophical, which is not the one Sepp is using. They're actually using it as a proposition, which he is not identifying at. Now, the problem that we get to here is that the bait and switch that's happening is that you're holding the atheist when you say you must hold the proposition to a position in where they can make sound arguments, and that position can be tested through arguments sensibly, and that's what Sepp alludes to. But then on the back end, to hold the psychological state of belief, which can't be tested sensibly, is the bait and switch. Because I'm saying you have to hold a propositional sense, which can be tested, but I'm going to hold the psychological state of belief, which the literature says cannot be tested. So if we had I'm about to say contingency, if things were to be held equally, then he would hold his position of agnosticism to be, like Sepp has just said, as a knowledge claim. And if that was so, then he would be consistent in saying, well, I'm only holding atheism to a proposition, but because it's the philosophical way. And for the same reasons, I have to hold agnosticism as a proposition because the literature says that this is the best way to do it in philosophy, not switch it. Go ahead.
If you were to, it seems to me this is going back a little bit to what I was saying about the odds and the evens, is that the atheist is in the position of challenging Steve's position by giving him reasons to think there are no gods, and Steve would have to then defend either that I'm not capturing all God concepts with these things, right? That I'm not filling out I'm not addressing all the possible ones that Steve can conceive of by these arguments, or that my reasons are flawed. He would have to demonstrate. Like, that's how I would actually engage Steve. It is right in that he doesn't have there's the proposition in question is whether Steve lacks the ability to render a decision. Like, that's if I'm persuaded that Steve is in the wrong, that's what I'm going to be persuaded of. I'm going to be persuaded that no, you have the adequate tools, and here, let me tell you, these are them because I think I have them too, right?
Yes. But I do want to make a mention. He can. I'm not saying he can't define himself as a lack of belief agnostic. I am not saying that, and I don't want to allude to that. But what I am saying is that the reasons why he's defining himself as a lack of belief agnostic are in contrary to why he's holding atheists to a proposition. Because if you're only going to hold to philosophical definitions and then point us to a paper that says these are the reasons, these are the philosophical definitions, and we're going to hold them propositionally, then the bait and switch is there when it comes to terms of agnosticism, which he says that he's defined as a belief state, the literature that he's pointed to doesn't suggest that, because the paper, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the whole paper, other than the definition of agnosticism, from that point on, the paper's only referring to agnosticism as a proposition. So unless Sepp is saying we're saying the whole article in Sepp is referring to the colloquial version of agnosticism, then Steve has a problem.
Ozzy, are you catching the bit that I'm missing? Did Ozzy hear me?
I think he's muted. I think Imp may be able to explain a little bit better.
Y'all see me now?
Yeah, there we go.
I missed a lot that Ozzy was saying. As far as on agnosticism, I man, because my computer acting stupid on me. But what was the question that Bert just asked? And I want to get back to Ozzy as far as on the agnostic actually being a middle. Ozzy, did you say? Do you agree? I guess that agnosticism is some kind of way of middle ground between atheism and theism?
Yeah, I see agnosticism as a middle ground. I don't want to rehash everything I said before.
Right.
To bore everybody. But yeah, in short, I think it's a middle ground. People who identify themselves as agnostics really bristle when people go around saying, "Oh, well, if you're an agnostic, you lack a belief in a God, therefore you're an atheist," and they bristle because agnostics invariably are people who have come to the conclusion that they can't affirm a God exists, nor do they feel confident that a God doesn't exist. People like me who call themselves atheists think that gods don't exist. So they don't. Those other people don't want to be confused with people like me, right? And this is a very widespread view, and I think it's a perfectly sensible view. Because they are on the fence. So let's go back to the gumball analogy here. If you have a jar of gumballs and I say, look, it's kind of like God exists or God doesn't exist. There's no two ways about it, right? Either God exists or God doesn't exist, right? Well, with the gumballs,
right. Only two possible answers for that, right?
Right. It's either even or odd, right? And now imagine if I said to you, are you an evenist or an oddist? Don't give me any of this middle ground, saying I can't decide. I'm inconclusive, exactly. Right? You have to be an evenist or an oddist. Right. And they're right. If I said to you, you're not an evenist, therefore you're an oddist, you would say, well, wait a minute, that's completely capricious. You don't get to dictate that. As a matter of fact, I neither affirm evenism or oddism. I'm on defense. And so that's how agnostics see it. And that's how they see themselves. And I think that's not an irrational position unless they hold that position for bad reasons. You can have bad reasons to be a theist. You can have bad reasons for being an atheist, and you can have bad reasons for being an agnostic. Steve McRae, to his credit, is someone who affirms that agnostics, such as himself, have to have reasons for their agnosticism. You have to have reasons for thinking that the question is open-ended and that there aren't good reasons one way or the other, and that neither party, theist or atheist, should be affirming theism or atheism. Right? He thinks that there's a burden that needs to be discharged. He happens to think it's not particularly difficult to discharge, but I don't know his specific reasons.
But and I get what you're on your point. Me and Steve's talked about it a lot. We have, but I think agnosticism is a very weak position. I really do. And I know you're a philosopher. I mean, I think it's a very weak position. But I don't think agnosticism is a middle ground between atheism and theism. Well, we know it's not as far as a proposition, but as a psychological state of belief, I can agree with you on that. As far as agnosticism, I mean, I guess like I said to you earlier, as being an indirect answer to the question, like you referring back to the gumball example. But when we ask the question, this metaphysical question, is there a God? Theism says yes, there is a God. Atheism says no, There's not a God. And now we have this term agnosticism that says, well, there's no way we think the question is basically, some agnostics, as you know, Ozzy, some agnostics say, well, we think the question is stupid because there's no way we can know. So yes, I think we should have a middle ground to that. But as you also know, Ozzy, there are some philosophers who don't even agree to the term agnostic, period, as explaining it. I mean, this is an old argument. This is an argument that's been going on for centuries and centuries. Bert, you want to step in and say something, Bert?
Yeah, if somebody says to me, well, that's stupid, we can't know, I go, well, sure we can. So let's say God is a creative force. Well, what do I think about? So I've got this concept of creating, right? And where do I get this concept? I get it from the fact that I create and that other things create, and
right.
Maybe I come up with a story about evolution, right, where I have an account by which this ability to create came about, and I have this evolutionary account that I can kind of lay out as to how the concept of creating and building things or making things came to be the case, but how structure is organized, right? But then, now you're just telling me that this being just happens to have those same qualities. Well, I find that dubious, right? Like there could be a with no account as to how he came to have them, right? It seems to me you're projecting these properties that you have onto it, and it's not, as Ozzy said, an impossibility that couldn't happen. But I can find that dubious. So I could come up with reasons as to why I think I can impugn that notion of a God. Any notion you come up with, that God has intelligence or that God speaks or God has thoughts, right? I've been over this with Trey Jadlow's concept of God, right? And there are concepts that we have when we say, I don't believe in God, you're referring to a concept. Well, what is it you're referring to? Or if you say you don't know if a God exists or if a God does exist, well, by God, you're denoting something. So what are these things you're looking for that you're not seeing? Like, what are the aspects, right? It can't be
exactly.
It can't be open-ended. Right?
It's funny, it's funny. But that's. Well, go ahead, Bert.
Well, just to finish the thought, my point is that they can hold the position that they legitimately cannot render a decision. They know what is referred to as God, but they see themselves as lacking the ability by their own power to render a decision. They don't have enough information, they don't have the tools or whatever, and that's legitimate, right? But if I think they're wrong about that, then the burden's on me to present to them reasons to think otherwise. Like, I don't think that they can't then just retreat to the corner. They're then confronted with these things, and maybe I've gone too far out on a limb. Maybe, oh wait, you know what? Actually, those aren't very good reasons. I've laid those out, and yeah, maybe they're right. Maybe I don't have enough reasons. Maybe I should be agnostic too, right? Like, so I think that I don't see it as being at a disadvantage. The fact that they lack a belief either way doesn't put me in a disadvantage. And the fact that I have to deal with propositions that I think aren't true, like God does not exist, I'm ready to defend that. Like, I don't see that I'm at some disadvantage compared to them.
Well, I do want to mention two things, because it seems like we're talking about, we're having, I think, a couple of different conversations. The first conversation is, which is the philosophical view of agnosticism? Which versus the colloquial view? And I think it's pretty clear. The philosophical view would tend to be the propositional sense. That's what Sepp says. That's what all the literature says. The propositional context of knowledge, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about agnosticism, not the belief position. The second thing I think we're talking about is, when we talk about the gumball example, for instance, is that we're mixing two different concepts. We're mixing the concepts of propositions with the context of psychological states of belief. And let me just make the point this way. For instance, with the gumball example, the propositions in that example would be they're even or they're odd, right? The evenness versus the oddness. Those are the propositions that have to be defended. But my psychological state of belief would be, I don't believe they're even, and I don't believe they're odd. That's my psychological state of belief. But those are the two propositions. With the gumball example, agnosticism, as a philosophical agnosticism, would be no one could actually know whether they're even or odd ever. That would be the position, not the actual. But it would encompass the lack of belief position. But it would be no one could ever know what the number of gumballs, whether they're even or odd. Someone can say, I believe they're even, but I'll never know. Or someone can say, I believe they're odd, and I'll never know. So that would also be agnosticism in that sense. So it does come in three different flavors, and that's taking agnosticism as the proposition where nothing could ever be known about this thing. And since that's the case, that can be tested through argument. Why do you believe that? How are you coming to that conclusion on that proposition? So if we're talking about three different propositions, theism is true, atheism is true, or agnosticism is true. That's in the gumball example. That's how we'd understand them as propositions. Go ahead, Emperor. I'm sorry.
But and I want Ozzy. I know Ozzy. I think Ozzy probably has something to say. But just looking at agnosticism, and this is what I was telling Steve. And this is what I still say. When one is declaring himself agnostic, you're really not answering, the question about a religious belief, because it's not a belief claim. It's basically a knowledge claim, according to philosophy and SCP. It's a knowledge claim. So it's basically you're taking the epistemological stance about knowability, about knowledge, and I think that's it. But back to what Bert was saying, just want to touch on Bert saying before Ozzy, whoever else want to talk. Bert was saying basically, and I agree with this. Just because I don't know something or I don't have an argument to basically, just because I haven't found an argument to basically argue against or for, that doesn't mean that that's a position, that's a good position to take. You know what I mean? Because if there are atheists or there are theists to argue for their position, then what really is the agnostic position when it comes to that? What are you saying when you're saying I don't know? I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough information. Is that basically what you were saying, Bert?
Well, so I just want to key in a little bit onto what Nate had said, that either atheism is true, theism is true, or agnosticism is true. And I'd be careful with that, because it may be true that somebody is an agnostic, but what do we mean if we say there's this third state of agnosticism is true? That would, based on Nate's analogy, it would seem like what that is meaning to say is that the proposition that we lack the tools to render a decision is true, and that's a claim by the agnostic, right? It could potentially be a claim by the agnostic,
yes,
and that itself is a proposition that they would need to defend. They would need to defend that. Well, I lack the tools, right?
Right. I agree.
But I would be careful labeling that as agnosticism is true. I think that's a funny way to put it. I guess.
It is. But it's but that's how it would you would understand it as a proposition. If it's I'm you're defending whether it's true or whether it's not true. But and Drag, you were saying Sokka wants to get in. I do want to just. Well, Ozzy, go ahead, finish your point, because you've been waiting for
Ozzy wanted to finish his point.
Oh, well, I'll pick up on what Bert was just talking about. It's kind of queer to talk about agnosticism as a position at all. It seems to me it makes sense to talk about agnosticism as a position if it's the position that nobody is in a position to rationally affirm the existence or non-existence of God.
Right.
That's a very strong position, right? As opposed to sort of the more fence-sitter position, where the person is just sort of, for the time being, in a holding pattern, unable to reach a conclusion either way, right? But even in the strongest case, the Huxleyan case, where the person says nobody is ever legitimately in a rational position to say that God exists or God doesn't exist. All those people are just out to lunch, right? Even if that's your position. Even that's not an ontological claim. That's not a claim about whether a God exists or not. That's a claim about the state of the evidence, and that we're never in a position to decide it, right? That's a claim not about whether a God exists. That's a claim about whether or not the question is decidable. It's a meta claim. It's a claim about the state of the discourse, right? So agnosticism as a proposition isn't even about whether or not a God exists. So this is, I think, where Emperor Atheist feels a little uncomfortable when people say, well, I'm an agnostic, and he feels like, well, that's not really answering the question. Okay, well, it is and it isn't answering the question. It's not answering yay or nay. It's not affirming nor denying. Okay, so it's not giving a yes or no, right? But that's why we bring up the gumball analogy. In the case of a gumball, right? If a jar of gumballs, if someone asks you, is the number even or odd? You can say, as a rational person, I have no idea. I'm undecided, right? I might have a hunch one way or the other, right? Slightly, but there's no way I can confidently and rationally affirm it. My reasons are so weak for evenism that I'm not going to affirm evenism. The reasons that I can think of for oddism are so weak and so easily defeated. I can't get behind it. I can't.
And you may never foresee a way by which to render the decision. You may be that I'm never getting into that gumball jar.
Right, and in which case, so whether you think the question is always going to be undecidable or just for the time being undecidable, that's the right answer. That's the rational answer, and that's why that we have this sort of gumball example. The whole point of introducing this gumball example is to say, look, we can all imagine a case where ontologically the case is either one or the other, right? It's either yes or no. It's either even or odd. There's no two ways about it. It can't be both and it can't be neither.
Right.
Nevertheless, we can understand that it would be a rational position and a rational response to say, I'm undecided, right? And now I could come along and say, oh yeah, well, I'm an evenist. And here are my reasons. And I might have some good reasons, right? Maybe having to do with the size of the gumballs, and I've performed experiments where I've tried this, to see how many, and by looking at the jar, it seems to me this is about the right number. It looks like an even to me, right? Maybe I've done this experiment 100 times, filling this similar sized jar with similar sized gumballs, and it seems to me this is going to be exactly even or something like that. Okay, I might have good or terrible reasons, okay, but that would make me an evenist. So the point is that one could be an evenist or one could be an oddist, but in most cases, it would make sense to be on the fence. So the idea is that a middle position, okay, is perfectly reasonable. And here is a difficulty people have. Just because there can only be two ontological states of affairs does not mean that the only doxastic states, that is, doxastic has to do with beliefs, that the only states of belief or absence of belief are binary as well. It's simply not true that just because there can only be two ways that reality can be, that there can only be attitudes that you can hold. You can hold the attitude even, you can hold the attitude odd, or you can hold the attitude, I don't think either one of them is true, even though I know one of them has to be true. That's a perfectly reasonable position to hold. What would be unreasonable is if a person said neither of them is true, or if a person said both of them are true. That would be irrational, right? But to simply say, I can't make up my mind. And that's why I think the best way to understand agnosticism is not that the person lacks knowledge, right? Because I lack knowledge. I can't say that I know to a certainty that gods don't exist, right? But I'm fully prepared to argue.
You know a lot, Ozzy. You know a lot.
Yeah, and I have to correct something. Right, twice now somebody has said that I'm a philosopher. I'm not. I have a background in philosophy. I studied philosophy as a grad student. I'm not a philosopher. I don't work in a university. I'm not published in philosophy or anything like that.
But let me say this. Let me ask you. Hold on, Nate. One thing I just want to ask Ozzy. This is a great topic for me. So Ozzy, so basically, I just want to see. So you're saying basically, I'm saying that the inability, right? This is basically what I'm saying. I think that just because a person has the inability, right, to come up with an argument for or against God, I just don't think that inability for that person to come up with an argument for or against God is good enough for that. Is justification to suspend judgment. So do you agree that? So you're basically saying, Ozzy, that a person, just because this person has the inability to come up with an argument for or against God, then they do have basically justification to suspend judgment. You're saying yes, they do.
No. What I'm saying is it could be rational. It would depend on their reasons.
Oh, okay.
You could have crappy reasons for being an agnostic. I'll give you an example of a really bad reason to be an agnostic, and I hear this one from a lot of people. Okay, they'll say, I can't prove conclusively that a God exists, and I can't prove conclusively that a God doesn't exist. Therefore, I'm an agnostic. That seems to me to be setting the bar so high on rational belief, all right, that then, of course, if that were true, then everyone should be an agnostic, right? But that's ridiculous, right? I mean, I can't prove that Bigfoot doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean that there aren't good reasons for thinking that Bigfoot doesn't exist. So some agnostics, not all agnostics, by no means all, but many agnostics make the mistake of offering as a defense of their agnosticism that they cannot conclusively demonstrate to a logical certainty that a God does or doesn't exist, and therefore they need to be on the fence, as if nothing short of a geometric proof, one way or the other, will suffice. That, I think, is just sort of setting the bar on rational belief for against a God absurdly high. But there can be better reasons. For instance, I've known some agnostics who argue along the following lines. I have studied the philosophy of religion for a long time. I've studied human psychology for a long time. I know something about people's dispositions to believe, the kinds of fallacies that they fall for, the kinds of cognitive biases that they're subject to. I'm familiar with the philosophical and evidential arguments in favor of a God and the counter arguments. And on balance, I find that there are some weak arguments for a God's existence and some weak arguments against God's existence, but nothing so strong one way or the other as to warrant a belief. That, I think, is a reasonable defense of agnosticism, right? But then you'd have to get into the nuts and bolts. Well, exactly how good are your defeaters against atheism? How good are your defeaters against the theistic proofs of God, for instance, right?
Gotcha.
So you can be a rational atheist, or you can be an irrational atheist. You can be a rational theist or an irrational theist. And you can certainly be a rational agnostic or an irrational agnostic. But so I don't think agnosticism is rational by default any more than I think theism is rational by default or atheism is rational by default. You have to have reasons, and they can't be any old reasons. They have to be reasons that conform with the norms of rational discourse.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense.
I do want to say one thing, and I just do want to. The point I'm trying to make is that I actually agree with everything Ozzy said. I do think it could be an extremely rational position. Actually, I think it's probably the best position. Psychologically, I don't believe either claim. But I would rebut by saying the best position to describe yourself as agnosticism. I agree. Ozzy has said it eloquently. But I just want to be clear. That's not the philosophical position that's being presented in SAP, IEP, Oxford, or any of these papers that describe agnosticism. That's one version of it, yes, that the literature expounds upon and says is out there, and even with in and out philosophy. But even in this paper, it's using the philosophical understanding that this is a knowledge claim compared to atheism and theism. It is a proposition in of itself. And that's what I think the disconnect is, because as a psychological state of belief, everything Ozzy said is 100% accurate, and I agree with that. But then I would also use that argument for an atheist who says their position is also a lack of belief.
What would the knowledge claim be, though? The knowledge. Oh, wow, nice handlebar there, Saka. Yes.
Saka counted in?
You know what, Saka? You go ahead. I'm going to let you speak. I want to look at that thing.
Let's Saka talk. Let's Saka talk.
I was going to say, that's what she said.
It's amazing. I know. It started off as a Movember joke, and I'm like, no, I'm going to sport this. I love this. When me and Nate we were discussing this the other day, one of the main kind of points that I brought up to challenge him on this, was that I understand the argument that Steve puts forward, and I understand what you're putting forward as kind of reputation for it. But I think that the main point that we'll come back to on this one is that the idea, when you go back to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy there, which I think, I'm not sure if it's been pointed out already, it's a good resource to use, but it's not an authority in all this stuff. But the point there would be that the way that they describe agnosticism is like any ism. Any ism would be in reference to some type of proposition. That's how the word is traditionally used. But even though an ism is generally in reference to some type of propositional content out there, that doesn't mean that the position of agnosticism, holding a psychological set of belief, isn't a philosophical definition. And I think that this is the part that even when we talk about the different understandings of the term atheist, where you have one that's more, I would say, kind of a traditional one that's you'd see reference a lot further back in history compared to the more kind of modern simply lacking a belief definition. That doesn't mean that one of them isn't a philosophical definition, or that one of them is more philosophical than the other. I don't even know what qualities go into something to describe it as a philosophical definition. And so maybe it was one of the things I wanted to clarify here with Ozzy is that if you're going to come out and say, okay, well, I only accept philosophical definitions. Okay, great. What is a philosophical definition? And yeah, that's the only challenge that I would have to this is that, yeah, if you're going to use agnosticism to describe something as a psychological state of something, does that automatically mean that it's not a philosophical position? Because I don't see why.
Well, I think was that addressed to me? I heard my name there, but yeah, okay. I think agnosticism functions. I said this at the outset. Functions in two ways. It functions as a psychological description of someone who's undecided. But there are different reasons why you can be undecided. One reason you can be undecided is you've considered some of the arguments and you can't come to any conclusion on the basis of the arguments for and against. They're just too weak. They just don't move you to affirm the positive or the negative position. So that's one reason. That's just a biographical fact, right? That's why we say it's descriptive, it's psychological. It's just a fact about your biology or rather your psychology. It's biographical, right? But then there is this more robust form of agnosticism that can be formulated as a doctrine, and that is the doctrine that God as a concept is such that we are epistemologically blocked from ever answering that question. We can never know. That's the Huxleyan view of agnosticism. That's not the fence sitter. That's the more robust. Yeah. And now notice, that I think has a very high burden. If you're going to argue that God isn't just not known to me, but unknowable to anyone ever, such the question will always be undecidable in principle by everyone forever, boy, you better have some strong arguments for that. That is a tough row to hoe, I think. Some people have undertaken that, but I think that is an unsustainable and irrational form of agnosticism. I think the burden of justification on that agnostic doctrine, that positive claim, I think that burden is too high to be met. I don't know of any agnostic that can meet that. But I think that the weaker psychological understanding of agnosticism as merely the state of indecision, that can be rationally discharged simply by an examination of the person's reasons for and against the arguments, their assessment of the arguments for and against theism and atheism.
Yeah, can I offer?
Okay, go ahead, I just wanted the one clarifier there was that what qualities does a definition need to have in order for it to be a philosophical definition? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at here.
Oh, okay. I beg your pardon. Okay, there isn't one. There isn't some set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something being a philosophical question or a philosophical term. It's something is a philosophical term for the same reason that something is an architectural term or a geographical term, or if the people in a certain domain of inquiry use the term a certain way, then that defines how that defines it in that domain, right? So something philosophical atheism, or let's say, look, consider skepticism. Okay, a lot of people on YouTube follow people who are self-described skeptics, and they may think of themselves as skeptics, right? Well, skepticism in that sense is very different from philosophical skepticism, which is a broad umbrella for a whole suite of different schools of skepticism, from ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism to other forms of radical skepticism, to more modest forms of skepticism. And it has absolutely nothing to do with critical thinking, right? So skepticism in ordinary parlance refers to critical inquiry, critical thinking, examination, scrutiny, right? And as opposed to philosophical skepticism, which is a kind of doctrine about epistemology, right? Or it's actually a set of different epistemological doctrines, okay? And so, well, what makes something a philosophical definition of skepticism? Well, it's the philosophers in the philosophy departments and throughout the ages have been talking about these questions and been using the terminology that way. So it's just an in-house baseball thing.
Wait, can I say two things I'm going to say? Was that way back when Nate was talking, and he had said that at the tail end of what you were saying, you had said that as opposed to the psychological agnosticism, that the philosophical definition entailed a knowledge claim. And my question coming out of my mouth was, which we ended up hitting on, was, what does that knowledge claim entail? Like, it is, when we say that it's a knowledge claim, I think what you're saying is the Huxleyan version of it, which is a claim to knowledge that it can't be known. And that, as Ozzy pointed out earlier, is to describe the state of the debate and not relating to God. It's the question of God itself, but rather whether a God can be known, which is a different question than whether that is not the question of the agnostic. And so I think it's completely appropriate that I suspect that Steve falls to the psychological state, because that is the most apt way to describe what his that best describes kind of what his state is. And the other thing I was going to say was in terms of the knowability of gods and the Huxleyan state, is that one thing I've always found curious is that people want to denote things of God, right? They want to ascribe this thing that they're referring to with characteristics. And my question would be, is where are they getting the grounds by which to ascribe it characteristics? Like, those seem like testable things. Like, if you're saying that God must be a designer, there are facts of the matter related to how you arrived at that idea of this being having those properties or whatever. So there's always been a bit of I probably didn't describe that very well, but I guess what I'm saying is that I've seen people want to suggest that God has X properties, but then pull back from ascribing those properties when it comes to how they know that he has those properties. Well, it can't be known, how are you getting those interactions in such a way that you would come to that conclusion that there could be something of that nature? Does that make sense?
It does, but and it's interesting because I actually wanted to touch on something you said right before you asked the question, if I may.
Okay. Sure, yeah.
And how I want to explain this is that so it's kind of in line with what Saka was saying too. It seems like we had an understanding of this is the way we describe these words in this particular context because of this source. And this is one of the many sources that describe it in this way. So, people say, let's look at the dictionary, and they say, no, you have to look at the philosophical sources and see how they use the term within that discipline. And that's the term that we want to kind of adhere to. So an examination of SEP does that because it does go through, and I think Saka's correct in this sense, all these terms are actually philosophical terms, no matter if you hold them in a psychological state of belief or proposition. So I actually agree with that. But I do agree is that when the argument is made that because this literature uses this one word in this way, and here are the reasons why it uses that word, then we can take that reasoning and test that. We can say, okay, well, how does it use this other word, which is agnosticism? And it tells us, okay, it has the same kind of dichotomy, psychological state of belief versus proposition. And then in that same work, it says, well, we're only going to use it in the proposition because that's the best way we can use it in this particular discipline. And my reasoning would then, and I think all of our conclusions would be the same. That, okay, so that seems to be the psychological sense of that word, agnosticism, just like we came to the conclusion, not psychological sense, the philosophical sense of agnosticism is the same as the philosophical sense of atheism, because we determined atheism as a proposition was the philosophical understanding based on this same logic. So
Right.
I'm just trying to be consistent with the logic that we're employing. If we're saying for atheism, it has a philosophical understanding, and that's based on it being held as a proposition, and SEP is going to be
Best use. Well, Nate, best
then we
use.
also do best use.
As a proposition, right?
Then
Right.
we have to also accept that same conclusion for agnosticism being understood as a knowledge claim, because that is the best use of it in psychology based on the sources that we've just seen.
Right, and I think
sorry,
Oh,
go ahead, Saka.
sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, and that's the problem with like this whole thing is that I've kind of changed my mind on this from how I used to think about this. Is that I would have said things like someone who comes out there and says that atheism is merely a lack of belief, that wasn't a philosophical definition. And that's one of the things that we get from a lot of people that are really adamant about defining definition in such a way that it is propositional based. And but when you think about it, is that the roots of the definition of atheism being a mere lack of belief, from what I understand, stuff that came from Anthony Flaw there. Like this was based on the grounds of in philosophy. It came out of a philosophical paper for this. So it's the reasoning that he came to, that atheism can only be described as, or atheism can be described as a mere lack of belief as well as propositionally based, would be rooted in philosophy still. So if someone's going to come out there and say that that they only want to use the philosophical definition of atheism, at this point in time, I don't even know what they mean by that anymore, because I don't know what a philosophical definition is. And it's the same thing with what you just said there, is that you are assuming that the philosophical definition of agnosticism, in reference to Steve's argument, is because he uses a propositional-based definition for atheism. Therefore, any philosophical position also must be propositionally based. And I don't think that actually follows there at all, that all philosophical positions have to be necessarily rooted in some type of propositional content. And so if that seems to be the back of the the grounding where you're putting your reputation for this, I think that's the only problem that I have with the way that you're presenting it.
Well,
I agree.
Hold up, Nate, because he mentioned Anthony Flaw. Saka, do you also recognize that Flaw's argument has been actually just refuted many times since, over as far as his definition of atheism? I mean, have you ever looked at that in any other of the philosophical notes and papers? He had
there's about every few years somebody comes out and writes up a paper challenging the presumption of atheism, the paper that Flaw put out there, and some of the legitimate challenges to it. But again, because that's the basis in which they challenge a lot of Flaw's arguments is the idea that you can, especially in reference to something like atheism, is that there is a default state that you can simply ride along, and as long as that you don't, that the theist does not present an adequate enough argument, that therefore that is just the grounds enough to justify a rejection of the claim, or at least to remain unconvinced and therefore maintain an atheist label for that. And I think that there is some problems, obviously, with that. That I mean, yeah, like I understand what the problems of the argument are, but again, just because there's problems with the argument, just because there's problems with the argument that Flaw is putting out there with the presumption of atheism, that there are, like I said, people can look them up. There's a lot of really good papers that do offer refutations for that, or at least challenges to the argument. Doesn't take away from the fact that the definition itself is grounded in a philosophy paper. So that's all I would say there.
Well, I just wanted to answer the first part, because I think you're right. I don't think you're wrong, in the sense of, if we were just talking about, since they use atheism as a proposition, then we should use agnosticism as a proposition and conclude that it's a refutation. I think that wouldn't be clearly good enough. But I think it's reasonable to read the paper and see their understanding of why they're using this term atheism as a proposition, and see the argument for it, and then but then not that alone doesn't give us how they're using agnosticism. They define it, they explain the two definitions, and then they conclude that from now on, in this particular philosophical paper, we're only going to use it in that way. So I think that line of evidence is a little bit more powerful than just saying we should just use every term as a proposition. It's the language in the actual work that leads to, and they conclude that we're only going to use it in this propositional sense. And the argument has been for the past 3 years that I've been on that if you look at SEP and look at the argument for atheism, that's why that one is, decided to be philosophical. Let's look at the argument for agnosticism, and the argument seems to be the same, and they even conclude we're only going to use it in this particular sense, in this philosophical paper. I do think the argument really kind of falls apart in the sense of, to like you're saying, really saying something is philosophical. It's hard to even define how a term is philosophical or not. But I'm thinking if this is the criteria we're using, SEP, and how SEP uses these words in this philosophical context, then I think the argument holds, because then you'd have to use agnosticism as SEP is using it in this philosophical paper.
But anybody else got something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of catch people up. For those of you who are just tuning in, we do have some questions, some facetious, some and some not. So to give kind of a brief summation, Steve's issue is that what he refers to as the philosophical definition.
Yeah, let's not get too far off track, right?
Yeah, it is the propositional version of atheist, agnostic, etc. That is what he defines as the philosophical version. His problem with atheists is that many atheists use what he refers to as the colloquial version, which is a non-propositional, a psychological state of belief, okay? So he does not want to be defined using what he considers non-philosophical terms and bemoans other people doing the same. The interesting thing is that the source that he uses labels Steve's own position as a non-propositional variant of agnostic. So on the one hand, he wants you to use what he considers philosophical terminology, while he himself really doesn't use that terminology to describe his own position. So I've put timestamps in the chat, and at the beginning of this hangout, we actually played the videos where he is describing his position and his issues with it. So if there's any kind of misunderstandings about what's going on, we'll do our best to explain it. And by the way, this is, an open hangout. We're trying to get some more people in here, but we do kind of want to transition away from it all. But essentially, if you wanted to be succinct about it, trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say this, and Soccer X basically was referring to Anthony Flaw and other philosophers. Then there are I guess what would be called in philosophy a wider thought on why atheism shouldn't be used as a proposition. But that's that's what we would call, I guess, I would consider it a revolting type in philosophy when we deal with it. Because when we actually understand atheism, then we're going to get back to Steve's point and how we actually see Steve's point as far as and how it relates to agnosticism. When we understand basically the theism, we understand basically the A to B negation and not basically just without. There's a difference. You know what I mean? So this is why most philosophers basically agree that atheism should be basically viewed as a proposition instead as a psychological state of belief. But this is a debate. This is an argument that's been going on for a long time. Still going on. This is why people should actually read new papers and keep going on as far as new philosophers and what they're saying about this particular thing, because it's a very interesting topic. But
I think on that topic, and also on the topic of Steve and his how he wants to refer or how we want to engage him.
Right.
I think for me, it all boils down to what are you saying about this proposition? God exists. You're saying you don't believe it. You're saying you do believe it, and you really want to just get to brass tacks, right? Like, so I've gotten into lots of arguments about the definition of atheism, but ultimately, if you're going to tell me you merely lack a belief, well, okay, there are that leaves up another option open. Do you also lack a belief that a God does not exist, right? Like, what, you lack a belief that God exists. Do you lack a belief that God does not exist? And okay, can you answer that question for me? And if the answer to that is yes, I also lack that belief, well, then you're in Steve's case. If you don't lack that belief, now you're saying something, right? You're now saying that you believe that gods don't exist, and so now we can, or that gods exist. I can't remember which one I put in there, but my point is that ultimately I just want to get to what it is you're asserting and what are your reasons for asserting it. And with Steve, it doesn't matter to me if he refers to himself in the psychological sense and wants me to engage him there in terms of his not holding a belief either way, and hold me to a proposition that I'm asserting is false. Let's go ahead and do that, and I will engage you on that part, and you can engage. And I don't see myself at a disadvantage, because in both cases, we both have to provide reasons, rationales as to why we think the other one's wrong. It doesn't alleviate any burden on his behalf. He needs to demonstrate why it is he thinks he can't formulate that opinion, or I have come to the opinion that there are no gods, and these are my reasons. Here, Steve, you deal with these, and how do you deal with these reasons? Because I think these hold water, right? So ultimately, you want to get past all of this, figure out what people's state is with respect to the propositions, and then just get right into debating. And it seems to me like all of this other stuff is it's important. So like the lack theism debate is important because I have on my YouTube channel a conversation with David Silverman that Ozzy was present for as well. And in there, you'll see me berate him because he is lumping agnostics in, people who are like Steve, who don't hold the belief that there is a God, and they don't hold the belief that there isn't a God. And he's lumping them with people who affirm the position that there are no gods. And those two people should not be yoked together, because they're going to have very different attitudes as to things like maybe school prayer, for instance. Maybe an agnostic is open to school prayer being a possibility, something that they're willing to entertain. Maybe they don't want to be counted as someone who doesn't believe there are gods because they are undecided on it. And when I charged him with that, David Silverman says, I don't care about those people. And he literally said that. I've got it on recording when I said,
you lie.
Look at you're bloating the numbers, and these people aren't going to want to be yoked with you potentially. And he said, I don't care. And it's because for him, his unfortunately, my motives are the same as him, in that I want to dissuade people of bad ideas, and I think theist ideas are bad ideas. And so we share a goal, but he's going about it in a very unprincipled manner. And this endeavor to change the definition, or to affect it in such a way as to obscure and make it obtuse as to whether this includes that group or not, right? Like to turn the numbers to 20% instead of 5% or whatever it is. I think it's doing it in an unprincipled manner is disingenuous. I think it's really in bad faith. I think it also is just wrong. I don't want people who, you have to go one step further with people. Oh, you're an atheist? Oh, okay. Well, do you believe, are you undecided? Like you have to, I want clear terms, right? Like I don't want to have to, now we have to come up with these new terms, right? Like essentially he just moved it one level deeper.
Right. The other thing with that is that it's not just moving like a small group of people under the umbrella that he wants to create. When you take a look at the polling and stuff like this, the people that recognize themselves as atheist, it's like, I can't remember what it is in the States, but it's like 3% or something like that, compared to upwards of 15-20% who recognize themselves as agnostic. Like he's trying to group a sizable population that is much larger than the people that accept his definition of atheism under his group, and say like, no, you guys don't have a say in this. We're gonna take you under our label.
Hold on.
Look, we're the same. You and I are the same. We both lack a belief. It's fine.
Did David? Did they come up with this term? Because I'm trying to figure out where did this lack of belief thing come from? Because it seems like
American atheist.
Oh, they started this.
So for what it's worth, at the time of that debate, or I think around the time of his book, because we also did a little book club thing on Helena Handbasket's thing, and we kind of went through the chapter by chapter of his book. And he's incredibly undisciplined even in his reading. Like the first chapter is hilarious because he's all over the place. The very case he's making for changing the term he then invokes as the what we shouldn't be doing, right, for his other point. And anyway, you should see it. It's a great discussion.
I gotta check it out, because I always thought this term was, I didn't know it was something recent. I remember, I know that Anthony flew, and I understood that. So I thought that I've always considered the term just antithetical to theism. If you're not a theist, then that was an atheist. So, but now I think it's gotten a little more ingrained. It's just like
the problem is
I can even say the same
for.
I can even say the thing for theists, like, if you say, do you believe in a God? And I say theist, and I can say, well, you didn't tell me if you're a Christian, I got to ask you another question, versus what question is actually being asked. Do you believe in God? No. But we all share that understanding that we all don't believe in that thing.
A person, the best way to think about it is that a person who lacks a belief in a God and lacks a belief that there is no God, that lacks both beliefs, shares one belief with the theist and with the atheist both. They're equally justified in being lumped with theists as with atheists.
Well, I would disagree with that, because the language wouldn't allow that, because theism...
Well, you just flip a negative.
Well, but isn't theism a term of affirmation? If you like for instance, like in law...
So is atheism.
Yes, arguably. Yes, I agree. But what I'm saying is that, let's say, for instance, for a jury trial, if you have 12 members of the jury, there are some people who are going to believe the defendant's innocent, and some people who won't believe he's innocent, but we don't ask him about innocence. We're only asking him about guilt. So we'll say, is the defendant guilty? That's why when a jury comes back, they'll say guilty or not guilty. They don't say guilty or innocent, even though people will say, oh, the guy was innocent. That's not true. He was found not guilty, because we're asking about the question of guilt. Now, it's true that some of those people on the jury may believe the guy is innocent. Just like some of the people who say their lack of belief will believe that God does not exist. But the question that was asked of them and the response to that question is appropriate for that full group. And now if we're talking about changing, if we're talking about what questions being asked or what are they responding to, then if you're asking me, if you're saying this thing exists, how do you feel about this being true? God exists, the defendant's guilty. Then I can say, no, I don't believe the defendant's guilty. But now you're right. There may be another question, but that next question would just depend on you not asking a better question to start. If you wanted to know more about my position, you could have asked me a more specific question. But if I'm responding to the question that you asked and say, no, I don't believe that, then, inherently, by me changing the term, I don't know, it's like you're telling me to answer a question you're not even asking.
I think there's a problem there. In our judicial system, we want to err on the side of caution, and so we have, unlike in discourse, in ordinary discourse, we expect people to have a rational defense of their positions if they want to claim to be rational. We understand that burdens exist on all sides, right? It doesn't matter what your position is. If you've got a position, then it's only rational if you have reasons for thinking that it's true, and that those reasons are good ones. But no one just has a burden while the other side doesn't, right? So if I walk into a room and I think the Democrats are the cat's ass, and Bert thinks that the Republicans are, and we get into a dispute, then he's got his burden of justification for defending his political views, and I have my burden of justification for defending my political views. There isn't one of us who has a burden of justification. There are as many burdens of justification in the room as there are positions in the room. But in our court system, we have decided that we want to err on the safe side, and we have just artificially, we've decided, and I think it's a good system, we've decided that we're going to put the burden solely on one person. Right? We've talked about this before, right? With some exceptions, it is the accuser that has the burden. The accused doesn't have any burden of showing that they're
the
innocent.
Presumption of innocence, right?
Right. We have the presumption of innocence. Okay, but when it comes to rationality, it's a condition of rationality that you have reasons for your position. There's no presumption of rationality. There's no such thing as a position that is just born rational. You either have reasons or you don't. So the difficulty with this sort of analogy with the court system is it breaks down when we're talking about rational discourse. And if I walk up to a person and I say, listen, do you believe that there's a God? Okay. And they say no. I don't know if they say no because, like me, they think there's no God, or they're just on the fence and they're undecided, right? A theist could walk up to the same agnostic and say, do you believe there's no God? And that person, that agnostic, is going to say no. Now imagine if that theist walks away saying, well, I have defined theism as the non-belief. I'm defining it negatively as the lack of belief in the non-existence of God. Well, now suddenly you've got an anti-David Silverman out there saying all the agnostics are subsumed under the umbrella of theism. This is not a principled way to argue. This is a way of deluding yourself into thinking that people who don't share your view share your view. Really, in my view, what David Silverman and American atheists ought to have done is they ought to have named, if they wanted to be like strictly accurate, I think that what they should have named their organization is American Non-Theists, and that would include agnostics.
You know what? It's funny.
Prejudicial.
I was looking up that word, but it's hard to find it in, let's say, in the literature itself too, because they even said like Sepp doesn't even use the word. It says maybe theological skeptic. Like this word non-theist, I've been trying to find it. It seems like it's one of those words that were made up for this position, because a lot of the literature seems to be trying to codify this position. And agnostic
it's at least 150 years old.
Yeah,
I found it in a number of dictionaries, but I can answer, why is non-theism such an obscure term? Because it's a useless suitcase umbrella term that subsumes a variety of positions that tells you nothing about what a person actually thinks. That's why non-theism is as useful as non-agnosticism. If I walked into a room and I said I'm a non-agnostic, everyone's scratching their heads, going, "What the hell does Ozzy actually think on the
But see, I've heard you. Hold on, I want to say this. I've heard you say that before. I've heard Ozzy say that before. Like it's non-theism.
I am a non-agnostic, by the way.
But I am a non-agnostic. But I want to ask you this. Let's say if I say you're a dog and not dog, and then I say everything we know what a dog is, but I say you're not a dog. Well, then you can be a cat, you could be a bird. I'm a non-planet, because that could also be not dog too. That can be any other thing. So it's almost like a perversion to say, well, I don't know what else it could be, but what you do know what it is. It's not a dog, because we're talking about it in terms of what it is. What it is. It's a dog, and you're saying, is this a dog? You say, no, it's not a dog. So you have dog and not dog.
Exist.
And when you have, hold on, let me finish. When you have this dichotomy with these particular words, it's just like when I'm saying dog and not dog, or mammal and not mammal. Yes, I'm identifying mammal, but when I say it's not a mammal, just because that's ambiguous, I'm talking about everything on the planet that's not a mammal. Every object that's not a mammal. We have a word,
non-theism. Non-theism's that word.
That doesn't mean that word is meaningless or irrational. That just describes what it's not. It's just that's one word describes what it's not, and we have a multitude of words that describe what something is not. It is not.
That's
non-theism. And atheism or non-theism
that's the answer
is
to the question.
Not a theist.
That's the question that you asked. You said, non-theism, it's an obscure word. Why do we need it? I'm telling you why it exists. The very reason you gave. It's nice to have a negation term. Well, we have a negation term for theism, non-theism. It's just not very useful because it's not very informative. Just like having a word for non-dog. I can coin a word, quatlu. Quatlu is everything that isn't a dog.
That's not a dog. That's true. So, but I do know something about it. I know it's not a dog.
Right, exactly.
And that's what it depends on. It depends on it depends on, and that's what I think. I think the issue is me. I'm talking about the question, and you're talking about the answer. You're saying the answer is not descriptive enough, but I'm saying the question needs to be more specific. Because you ask me, is it a dog, and I say it's not a dog. Then you can say, well, tell me what it is. But is it a dog? And I say no. Then you know one thing: it's not a dog.
Yeah.
So I agree.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why we have the word non-theism, and that's why it's not in wide usage, because. Yeah, it tells you a little something. It just doesn't tell you much that anyone gives a damn about in the great debate, in the discourse about God's existence. What we want is a typology that helps us understand what people actually think is the case. And a word that tells you what people don't think is the case isn't particularly helpful, because there's a lot of reasons there's a lot of ways that you can be a non-theist. Just like there's a lot of ways that you can be.
Yeah. So
previously, I would actually disagree with you, but I actually agree with what you're saying, because my position has changed too. So go ahead, Saka.
Yeah, like imagine if you're reading a biology paper discussing the mating habits of non-dogs in Africa. Okay, and then the entire paper itself is talking nothing about all it is referencing lions. Now, technically, like, yeah, it was completely accurate. This entire paper is about non-dogs, but there's why would you use non-dogs if really what you're talking about is lions?
Right, well, you'll often hear another example, an example you hear all the time to refer to groups of minorities are non-whites, right? Like I hear it on the news all the time, or if I hear them talking about demographics, I hear them talk about non-whites.
It's true.
But wouldn't it be? And see, the question would be, and this is what, and it's sometimes hard to understand language. Like, say if I was to ask a question, not non-white, usually the question would be, is this a white person or is this a dog? And the answer, no, you guys are saying is not good enough, because the question is this a dog? And I'm saying no. And hold on, let me finish it. If I say no, it could be anything. It could that leaves a universal possibility of things it could be. But we know it's not a dog. So it's just like with this question of atheism and theism or non-theism. Someone is saying there's a dog. Is that a dog? And I'm saying no. And I'm saying that's a good enough answer for the question that you asked me. Because if you wanted to know anything more specific, then ask me a more specific question. Don't ask for a more specific answer to an open question.
Another way to think about it is in terms of, if you have a Venn diagram of things, or you just have a circle, you have some things that are in the circle and some things are out. You want to be able to refer to the things that are not, you have a way of referring to the things that are and a way of referring to the things that are not. And all things are not might be in other, they might be in squares and might be other shapes out there. But it's a way to refer to everything that isn't a thing, right? I guess I'm not as hung up on the defining yourself by a negative. We kind of do it all the time. It's to describe yourself as a member of not the group that subscribes to X or whatever.
Well, just to be fair, I am playing devil's advocate. But my position has changed. Like I'm right now. Before, my position was lack of belief, which I still think is a fine position. Anybody who holds it, that's it. But my position, I've made it more specific and say I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God, but I don't know that's actually that could ever be true. So I'm a propositional agnostic and a philosophical and a propositional atheist. I don't believe it and I don't know it. So that's kind of my position, because I think it really encompasses. If somebody asked me, do you believe in a God? Do you believe gods don't exist? I would say, yeah. I believe they don't exist. So
the only reason I have an issue with it is because, well, there's two reasons. Number one is I then have to, because of the nature of discourse, and I see this happen to Matt Slick all the time, is people call in and they say, I lack of, he's wised up to it, but there was a time where people would say I lack a belief, and then they want to play. It's the same shell game you guys are complaining about with Steve, where that you felt like he was playing, was that they will use it basically to push up. Well, I'm not saying anything. I haven't taken on any type of, I'm not making a claim. You're the one making the claim, right? And so I have a real issue with that. And so because that gets abused, now if you say to me, I lack a belief, and then you don't also offer up, but I also lack a belief that gods don't exist. I lack a belief that gods do exist, and I lack a belief that gods don't exist. Now, because of that, I have to ask one more question. I have to ask, well, do you also lack this other belief? Like, it's not enough just to know, because there's more than two doxastic states. Saying you lack a belief does not then result, it's not a dichotomy. It doesn't result in me knowing something. I need to go one level deeper and go, okay, so what is your attitude towards the proposition that gods do exist? Right? I know that you believe,
don't exist.
Yeah, don't exist. But yeah, you will also lack a belief that gods don't exist.
But this is the problem I think with your retort. My issue is that you've asked them about one proposition, but then want them to answer about another proposition because you've just said, you've answered, and then you actually said, well, what do you think about this other proposition? So in one sense, you're asking me one question, but then are saying that I'm not answering this other question. You understand what I'm saying? That's the confusion.
Ultimately, what I want to know is which of those three states are you? Are you somebody to think that God exists, or you think that God doesn't exist, or you don't know, right? Like, I'm just trying to get to the answer of those three things.
And I agree with you. But if you're asking me, but the thing is that, and this is just my real misunderstanding here is that if you're asking me about one proposition and I answer that question about that proposition, and then the retort that I'm hearing from everyone here is, what do you think about this other proposition? Then I'm answering the question that was asked of me, and now I can answer the question. I do think if you're making an argument for pragmatism, that yes, if you answer both questions at one time by saying this, then that makes it easier for us to have the conversation move past this point. But then you can't. But then I think in your response to me, you said, by answering this question, but what about this other question? As soon as you said that, I said, well, again, I'm answering the question you're asking, and my answer is not fulfilling because you're then saying you're expecting me to answer some other question that you haven't even asked me.
So if I walked up to anybody in the street and I said, and somebody who's not engaged on these online discussions, right? And I said, or somebody who's not familiar with Matt Slick or isn't involved in these debates, and I said, do you believe in God? They won't say to me, I lack a belief in God. They will say to me, I believe gods exist. I don't believe gods exist. They'll give me something that will give me, because they know I'm trying to apprehend what their position is in relation to the existence of gods. Or they'll say to me, I don't know if gods exist, right? But that's not the response you will get from the internet atheists who subscribe to this position. They will say, I lack a belief. There's nobody on the street who will tell me that they lack a belief in gods when I ask them, you think that gods exist?
And that actually segues into some of the questions that people have been asking. So there's someone who did know about our guests and wanted me to ask certain questions, and then some of you in the chat who were gracious enough to ask some questions. So I kind of want to get into that before Nate wets himself. So this, I have actually about 3 questions. I'm going to try and make them as succinct as possible, and that actually towards Ozzy. Is there consensus in the philosophical community concerning the usage of terms such as atheism?
Yeah, I think fairly strongly within the philosophical community and philosophy of religion, for instance, in metaphysics, people use the word atheism as the positive doctrine that gods don't exist. That doesn't mean that you couldn't challenge it and argue it, and that it doesn't get that there don't exist other usages of the term. But I mean, the usage in philosophical discourse seems to be fairly consistent with what you would find out in the vernacular. Just walk out onto the street, and, talk to people who aren't atheist activists, for instance, and ask them what an atheist is, and they'll say, well, it's someone who thinks there isn't a God, That seems to be the general consensus. So, but I mean, that doesn't settle anything.
What about the same question, but instead of atheism, agnosticism?
I think agnosticism is a little bit more up in the air for the reasons we've already talked about. Agnosticism describes both a very strong positive position about the state of the evidence, and it also can be used to describe a psychological state, purely something biographical about a person. So it gets used very, very, as we say, it's polysemous. It polysemantic. It has two usages or two meanings, and they run in parallel all the time. And so when you're having a discussion about agnosticism in a philosophy conference or something like that, you're going to have to disambiguate which way you're using it. You almost never have to bother doing that when you're talking about atheism.
Right.
So
even though I must say this though, even though I agree with what Ozzy just said, but we also know though in philosophy, even though what Ozzy just said is supposed about a consensus, we still know even though the term atheism is still polysemous as well too though. Right?
Yeah. I mean, to say that there's a consensus is not to say that it's absolutely uniform and that there are variations. The consensus is that this is the way the wind blows, right? This is the way it goes. And that consensus could change. I mean, if atheist activists are successful enough in propagating the lack-theist definition that equates non-theism with atheism, then over time, as generations of people, grow up and get with the term atheism as it's defined on the internet, then of course that there could be a semantic shift that could absolutely happen.
I doubt it though. At least I hope not. But hey, who knows? Okay.
Well, nothing will change. It won't change anybody's burden of justification. Just because your lack of belief doesn't change the fact that if you think there's no gods, you need a reason for thinking that.
It's just going to make the conversation more tedious, but
Yeah,
we try to learn David Silverman's new terms.
We're all obligated to do so. He is the atheist pope, and we will do as he bids.
Well,
so,
but hold on. But one thing, though, I do want to say, I'm not sure about with the agnosticism, because we actually were looking very hard to see who defines agnosticism in this psychological sense, and that was a challenge. Like, the only real source that we saw that actually even mentioned it was CEP. IEP kind of had a little funny about it, and then there's some other papers, Oxford, all these other papers. Everything was a knowledge claim. Even when Googled it,
it's really up in the air. It's right. It's true.
It was really strong. As a matter of fact, it was harder to find agnosticism in the psychological sense than it was to find atheism, because atheism, I think, like you're saying, has this movement. So if that, even if that is true, I'm just saying most of the papers because me and Imp went on a search for it, most of the stuff that we found showed that this was not, and then CEP was just the cherry on the tape.
Right, but
that was what Ozzy said, right? Ozzy said that agnosticism was a lot more fuzzy in terms of
right. Yeah, Ozzy just said that.
I would say, but for the same reasons, you would say the term. It seems like we're trying to kind of save one, but understand that they both are in the same position, because you have both of these.
I was just asked I was just asked what the consensus is, and there's a stronger consensus on atheism than there is on agnosticism. So
I would agree with that.
I would also say that there is a push by American atheists to change the definition. At the time that we reviewed the book, you could do a Google search on the word atheist, and you would not find that definition in the bulk of them. There was like a 1 to 9 or a 2 to 9. There were 2 dictionaries that had their definition, and actually one of them was their own website. And then there were the next 8 search results were all the definition we've been referring to. And now when you look, actually a lot of them have changed. And I think American Atheists has been petitioning online sources to change their. And he said
that wouldn't be true for agnosticism, though, because if you go to like the first top 10 search results, it's all based in knowledge. So even if that's true for atheism with maybe this change, agnosticism seems to be at the stronger hold on this knowledge claim than atheism as a lack of belief, for instance.
Okay, I think Sokka's trying to get in.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is when you go online and you're looking for arguments or definitions or people writing stuff on agnosticism, it's more than likely that you're going to be finding obviously the propositional content, the propositional reference to agnosticism, because if you're not talking about anything in a propositional sense, why would you be writing a paper on this? Why would you be trying to present an argument for something if it's not propositional based? So I can understand why you'd find sources that would link more to a propositional definition of agnosticism, but that's only just by virtue of the burden or the argumentation that one of them would require compared to another definition of someone who's much like a weak agnostic.
Yeah. So to switch gears a bit, Ozzy, you saw a question earlier about methodological conservatism.
Oh yeah. I don't know. That was that in the side chat, or was that just in the internal chat here?
That was in the live chat, and I copy and pasted here in our chat.
Okay. So somebody was just asking what is methodological conservatism, and I'm assuming that they're talking about epistemological methodological conservatism. That doesn't have a whole lot to do with what we're talking about here, but the idea is this: that when you are evaluating the truth value of a claim, if you encounter a claim that contradicts something you already believe, what do? Do you accept the new claim, or do you accept the existing claim, right? In other words, there's a contradictory piece of evidence or a claim that contradicts something you believe. Does that demolish what you already think is true in the edifice of your belief set? Or does the consistency of your existing belief set undermine your believing in the contradictory claim that's before you? And the principle of methodological conservatism says that, well, unless there's a really, really profound reason to accept a contrary piece of evidence, you should actually stick with the edifice of your belief set. It's more prudent. It's epistemologically more prudent. So it's conservatism. Okay, it's kind of like doing a crossword puzzle. If you've ever done a crossword puzzle and you're like more than 3/4 of the way through and it's all working out nicely, and then you get to one, you get to 19 down, and you start filling it out, and you go, oh shoot, I'm pretty sure that I've got the right answer to 19 down. But if my answer to 19 down is right, everything else I've done is shit, and I gotta start over. Right?
And if you do that, that's when you stop being a Christian. That's exactly what happened.
That's right. So methodological conservatism would say, well, wait a minute, don't assume that everything you've done in the crossword puzzle is wrong. What are the odds that all the other answers you got were wrong, but just happened to fit? Surely, what you should be calling into question is this contrary piece of evidence. So in other words, methodological conservatism is a principle that mitigates the idea of refutation. Watch out. You don't just take a piece of evidence that contradicts something you believe, and you don't just let that shatter your entire belief set like a rock into a glass building, right? You need
look, I don't know how the fossils ended up. I don't know how the fossils ended up in an organized pattern in the strata, but it had to happen somehow.
Right. I know.
The devil put them there.
Density. It's all about density and buoyancy and
Don't you start. Don't you start. Don't. No, we're not having that tonight, folks. No, not tonight, Wiki Bobby. So
what happened, Drag? What happened, Drag?
That's flat Earth talk. That's what that is. You don't recognize it because that's flat Earth talk. That's why.
Flat Earth.
That's flat Earth. Yes, that's the same stupid stuff that they say. But
what's the next question, Drag?
So the next question is
smart people, very smart people.
So why do you think this discussion about the definition of atheism keeps coming up? And I'm actually going to direct that towards Sock Account because he said this a few times.
I think that there's two reasons. I think one of the main reasons why it comes up in this circle, like this, like kind of online discussion here, is just, I think by very nature, the fact that this is a community of people that really like to argue just about things. I think that to a certain extent that is there. Is that if there's something that we can bring up some type of contentious issue, we will. And the definition of atheism is a really good one because I don't think that there's any right answer. I don't think that either side is right.
True.
But I think it also comes back to the points that Bert brought up about David Silverman as well. Is that as atheism and as especially people that recognize themselves as non-religious, grows, that there's a certain strength and unity that comes from this as well, that allows for people that have become more along the lines of atheist activists to try to overrepresent the position that they have, and they have to do that through this means.
I think sorry.
But but I think that the political reason that we see from things like David Silverman is probably one of the large reasons as well.
I think there's a couple other reasons too. Is I think the etymology really throws people off, right? So they see atheist, not a theist, right? And I get that argument more than any other argument.
Right.
And I don't think people are gaming or anything. I think that they think they have a clear understanding of how these terms came about and what they mean. And look at you're being ridiculous. Clearly, the word breaks down in this way. Ozzy might want to say something about that because I know he knows a little bit more about the history of the word. But let me finish. One other thing was there's the aspect of the burden, and I think also this notion of a default position that, hey, look at, you're the one adding to the ontology here. You're adding a being. I haven't said anything about this being. I lack any beliefs related to this being, and now you're putting it in my face. You need to justify it. I don't need to tell you why it doesn't exist, right? You need to prove to me that it does exist. And I think people get confused about that as well, that somehow only positive claims that there's a default position of no ontological entities at all, and that I am safe to assume that things don't exist until somebody demonstrates to me that they do. And I don't have any burden to say that they don't. And I think that's another confusion people have.
Drag. Did anybody else have anything to say?
Yes, we got a few questions actually. Let me see.
I just heard you say something about the problem of evil. What was that?
Yeah, that was the last one. So I'm trying to go in order. Why hasn't Sokka made a Nephi parody channel yet?
Oh.
Oh man. I should. Like I have an old pair of glasses that like some of the ones that he has there. And I do have the big headphones. I think that what it is that I don't think that I can't mimic his speech well enough. I tried. I remember doing it as a joke in the hangout, but yeah, no, I can't bring myself to like that monotone of level for an extended period of time. It just hurts.
Fair enough. So have we moved the ball at all tonight, or will we be back just as strong, just as often among all those involved tonight? I think I'll answer this question. I can't force anybody to see reason, much less anyone else I've ever spoken to who may or may not be from New Jersey. So hopefully people have enjoyed the conversation tonight. Maybe learn something, maybe not. We're here just to have the conversation, not so concerned with whether or not people are convinced, but that the conversation is happening and that hopefully somebody somewhere can gain something from it.
Drag, are you throwing darts at your cousin G-Man?
I am not, sir. I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. I just want
lots of people who live in New Jersey.
Okay.
So next question is ask everyone if the problem of evil is an argument for atheism. If they say yes, ask them how it handles evil gods or lying gods.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that it's definitely in the roots of what we call like an atheistic argument, but it's only an argument against a specifically defined God, and that would be the one that has to have the three characteristics that are generally involved in
right.
Omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence.
Right.
If it doesn't, if the God you're referring to doesn't encompass those traits, then it wouldn't really be an atheistic argument. It wouldn't be an argument against it.
Let me answer that one. 9 times out of 10, when people ask questions like that, they probably 9 times out of 10 specifically talking about the Abrahamic deity, Yahweh, Allah, Elohim. And in that case, I guess we can deal. Guess we can deal with local atheism. Yeah, the argument for evil is probably the best argument. I would say the best argument against that particular God, the God of the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah. Yes, because
I would disagree. I think that would be a good argument to put against the God of the Christian Bible. At least
what now?
It would be good. It would be a good argument against some interpretation of Christian God. I don't think that would be a good argument against the God of the Torah, nor would it be a good argument against the Islamic God.
Well, yeah, it would, because all three. When you're saying interpretations, but when you mention interpretation, when you're dealing with theology, then you basically have to deal with consensus of interpretation. And when you're not dealing with interpretation of a certain sect, you want to deal with interpretation of theological interpretation. And what is the consensus of theological interpretation? Consensus is that all three of these particular gods, even in Judaism, when you separate the three concepts, all three of these particular deities are still believed to be omniscient, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, all-loving, omnipotent, all-powerful. These, and when we think about it, I mean, even without Christianity, when we just talk about Islam, and you talk about you talk about Allah. I don't know if you're familiar with the Quran, maybe you are. When you talk about all of the qualifiers that Muslim scholars, that the ulama say about Allah, is basically mirroring the same concepts of the Judeo-Christian God. He's all loving. He loves all humans, but at the same time, he hates people who hate his message of Muhammad. The same thing with the Bible. He loves all humans, the theological beliefs. He loves all humans, but at the same time, he's going to send you to hell if you don't believe in him. You don't accept his son, Jesus Christ. So yes, all three, particularly, they conceptually have the same idea of these particular qualifications that contradict each other in nature. So yeah, I have to go with that.
I actually have never found the problem of evil terribly persuasive as like a defeater. I think once you're already persuaded, I think then the problem of evil becomes a lot more obvious. But I think especially with respect to Christianity, and I know this, I was a Calvinist for years, and
sorry to hear that.
And I think there are enough rationales you can develop. The thing is that the Bible is I think incredibly inconsistent in how it deals with it, but there's actually to get some benefit out of that inconsistency in that it's very difficult to work out what exactly God is committing to or what God is not committed to. And so I think you can develop these rationales that make sense to someone who holds all the rest of the structure. They can fit in a rationale that insulates them. So I don't find it to be a terribly persuasive argument to people who hold those positions.
I think I think I disagree a little bit. I think if you're a Calvinist, if you're a Christian of that stripe, then yes, because that God's not a nice guy.
Right.
But there's a lot of people who are Christians where it's just a much more it's a milder God, a more benign God, a less ruthless God, a less implacable God, and that I think the problem of evil really weighs on Christians of that. But
I think those people's theology is pretty weak.
I agree. They haven't read their Bibles very carefully.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Right.
Well, what theology do you think is strong?
We're going to have a whole episode about that.
Yeah, pick one.
We're going into the hole right here. We're doing.
Before we get to that, let me finish these questions first.
Let us finish the questions. You throwing these random questions out here hurting us.
Because trust me, I asked my own parents about Calvinism. They had never heard of it. I had to explain Tulip to them. That was fun. Let's see. If a person thinks that agnosticism can be defined as sitting on the fence, do they think the same of those who identify as agnostic atheists?
I have a video.
Oh, great question. Great.
I have a video on my YouTube channel called.
Great question.
What's it called? My goodness, what is it called? It's called Agnostic Atheism. Does it make sense?
Hell no.
And watch the video. It's not terribly long. Where I unpack that.
Just make sure you have some coffee beforehand.
And no, it's short. It's one of my shortest videos, actually.
I'm going to look it up. If it's more than 30 minutes, you're going to see me laugh.
What was it? Where is it at, Ozzy?
It's on my YouTube channel, Ozymandias Ramses II. It's
okay.
And it's called Agnostic Atheism. Does it make sense? It's 10 minutes and 27 seconds long.
Okay.
I argue that expression is effectively nonsense, and I think you'll be surprised to see who agrees with me in that video.
Shit, I agree. Yeah, it's ridiculous to me.
But what do you got? But doesn't Sepp say you can be an agnostic atheist? Or like
Sepp
says you can actually be a Gnostic atheist.
They reference the usage of it. If I'm not mistaken, I have to look at it again. But they reference the usage, but they also reference the usage of using the psychological state of belief for agnosticism. So I mean, reference it doesn't mean that that it's a good position to take.
I mean, really. I mean, that's just like they reference like what Soccer Count had mentioned Anthony Flew. I mean, they reference Anthony Flew's definition of atheism, but they also reference it as being bad for an umbrella term for atheism. So I mean, they reference a lot of things that don't mean that, but they also sort of point to what's the best view of it. And basically, you keep reading and like they said in the beginning, atheism as a proposition. That being said, would be the best way would basically tell you that agnostic atheism really kind of like it's kind of, it's just kind of watered down. It's not really needed, basically.
No,
but I'm not knocking people who call themselves agnostic atheists. I'm not knocking them. If you want to call yourself an agnostic atheist, cool. I ain't got no issue with it. But I don't like the term. I don't agree with the term. No, I'm with Oz on that.
I just have to disagree from reading it, and I may be interpreting it wrong. It says Sepp is holding both of these terms as propositions, and if you do that, it's saying that you can be an agnostic atheist, an agnostic theist, because one is speaking to belief and one is speaking to knowledge. So those two different claims, I don't believe, I don't know, or I believe, or I do believe, but still I don't know. So that's how it's treating it. So are we talking about those agnostic atheists, or are we talking about some other type of agnostic atheist? Because this is saying this is kind of saying the view is okay to have that view, and it even goes into saying Gnostic atheists and people who claim to know, even though they do quote that to be some irrational, but they're saying there are people out there who claim to be Gnostic atheists or Gnostic theists.
Right.
Next question.
Well, can I just cap that off? There are also Gnostic Gnostics. There are Gnostic agnostics.
Right.
That is to say, a Huxleyan agnostic is a Gnostic agnostic. That is someone who purports to have an argument for why no one can ever know that a God exists or doesn't exist.
They know you can't.
They know
that you can't. I don't know. I'm reading this out of the actual paper. You know, the paper.
Like I need to.
Yeah, I need to see that. I need to see that cited somewhere because here.
Yeah, that's true. He's right.
Yeah, here. Sepp cites
I'm not citing anybody. I'm not citing anybody there. I'm just saying by that logic. Right. If you're going to use the word Gnostic and agnostic with respect to knowing that a belief is true,
yes,
then a Huxleyan agnostic is a Gnostic agnostic.
Okay.
Which makes no damn sense.
Yeah. Yes. It's a contradiction. Right. Literally a Gnostic agnostic.
Right.
Which is stupidity. So I think this is that's a ridiculous of the usage.
I know. Right. I know for a fact that I don't know.
Yeah. Better than that, I know for a fact that it's impossible for anybody to know on this.
Right. Yeah, I know for a fact. Right.
I'm going to start using Gnostic agnostic. Just to see how many people I can get.
You should call Matt Slick's show and tell him that you're a Gnostic.
Hold on.
We're not endorsing people do that, but if you
I lack a belief that I could know.
Maybe I'm not. Maybe this is me. I don't understand. Not Gnostic agnostic is saying somebody's saying I lack belief, but I know I lack belief. I'm not understanding it. You're right. Maybe that's it. Is that it?
I think that's the problem. Wait, hold on. So you're Gnostic agnostic?
So you lack belief that you know you lack belief. I don't know.
Well, look,
I'm not even saying how we get there. I'm like, what?
He lacks belief that he knows he lacks belief.
I knows I lack belief.
Look, the problem with the expression agnostic atheist is that it only makes sense if the word atheist in that expression refers to a proposition and not a lack of belief.
Yes, that's what Sepp says. Right. Correct.
Right.
Sepp says holding both the propositions, everything is okay.
But in common
parlance, but David Silverman and Aaron Ra and all those people, they will insist that you can be an agnostic atheist, and it makes a lot of sense. And what they mean by atheist is lack of belief. If you're an agnostic atheist, then what you're saying is that you lack. That's right. That you don't know that you lack belief.
That doesn't make matter of fact, that means all atheists actually, if that way, would also be agnostic. You couldn't have agnostic atheist.
The next time I go drinking with Aaron Ra, I'm going to tell him that I am a Gnostic agnostic, and I want to see if he repeats it. Nobody tell him, okay? No one tell him, but I'm going to try my best to prank Aaron Ra.
I just like him to watch that video. I
just wanted to make sure that you weren't saying that what Sepp was saying was wrong, because Sepp is saying atheist as a proposition, which is the belief, and that's what I'm thinking. But I understand what Ozzy's saying, holding as a lack of belief.
Right, Ozzy is saying that most of these atheists out here who claim to be atheists,
lack of belief,
saying they're atheist agnostic, are using the definition of atheism as a lack of belief. And then you're adding a qualified agnostic, and it don't make no damn sense.
Yes, because that's what I was doing. I was doing that, and that's why I had to change to say I believe no gods exist and I don't know, because lacking, yes, I agree.
Yeah, well, that's the thing where you're talking about people using terms as in common parlance versus being more, I guess, philosophically rigorous in how you're defining it. And I think, Bert, you were discussing this in the off-air, on the off-air, or is it still on the off-air, where when we're talking to our parents, my parents have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about. In fact, my mother said that she can barely read some of the stuff that I put on there. I had no idea until she had said that. And I'm having to try and explain things to her. And she's just like, you just need to tell me what you fucking think, boy, and quit talking to me like that. You know, and so that's pretty much, she responds to this. So, I want to place an emphasis not so much on the verbiage used by people and more emphasis on the concepts themselves and understanding.
What do you think, and what are your reasons for thinking it, right? Like, it's really, really simple.
Yeah, because I hear people use the term, well, it's my personal theory all the time, and trust me, it bothers the shit out of me every time someone says that. I can't tell you, I twitch every time.
Drag, that's only your opinion. That's merely your opinion.
Oh,
it is.
Go to the next question. Don't forget the next question, Drag, because it's getting a little
let me
late.
go to the next question. Yeah, I'm about to say,
that's just your opinion.
So, Three Black Heathens, if atheists have a burden of justification, who are they supposed to justify their atheism to? If it's just to themselves, then what's the point of even bringing it up?
So I'll take the start on this one. Is that if it should be to yourself? Number one is because when I'm thinking about, I know right now there's nobody up on this. I have a stairwell over here. I know there's nobody up here, and I have reasons for thinking that that's the case. And if I was to get up and wanted to take off my pants and walk across the room, I should have good reasons for knowing that there's nobody standing up there, or that there's nobody in my window or anything. I have reasons to think things, right? And so you want to be able to have rationales behind what you think, because you are going to depend on these things to act, right? Ultimately, we want to act based on our beliefs, and it's our map of the territory, and we want to know what the lay of the land is and have some ability to justify why it is we think that. My great example is that when my wife will ask me, there's times where she asks me, "Hey, what time's the party tonight?" And I say 9 p.m. And she goes, how'd you know it was at 9 p.m.? And if I say, I don't know, it may be the case that I know it. It may be that I read it earlier in an email or something, but we should both worry a lot if I can't raise to awareness how it is I know, right? Maybe it was 8, right? Like if I can't remember how it is I know it, well, fuck, maybe I shouldn't put much confidence in that. Maybe I should go call a friend and make sure or whatever, right? So that's why you'd want to actually be able to render the rationales for the things that you hold to be true. And that's true with God too, right? If there is a God, if the Christian God is true, well, fuck, I better know that, right? Because there's some consequence there to it, right? Like that's my annoyance of theists who argue, why, if you don't believe in a God, why are you arguing against it? Doesn't that demonstrate the existence of God, that that you've taken a position? Do you take position against other things you don't believe? And well, when it has consequence, yeah, I do, right? Like, and in my example of the person who is not standing up on my stairwell is a good example of that, right? There's, so anyway.
Ozzy, can I ask you? I wanted to ask you a quick question, if you have knowledge, then you have belief. One is sufficient versus necessary. If knowledge, then belief, right? What would be the contrapositive of that?
If not belief, then not knowledge.
So not belief, then not knowledge. So that would be your agnostic atheist. If not belief, then not knowledge, right?
Yeah, if you don't believe it, then you don't know it, right?
Yes.
Because it would be a contradiction to say, I know that this is a cup, but I don't believe that this is a cup, right? That would be a contradiction, right?
So it does logically follow, because I was trying to figure out why agnostic atheist doesn't follow, because we were all laughing. But if that's the case, I don't believe, therefore I don't know. It's a lot. You can be a agnostic atheist in that sense, because the atheist is saying I don't know, and then you can
be an agnostic atheist provided what you mean by atheism is the proposition that God doesn't exist. You just can't be an agnostic atheist if what you mean by atheist is the lack of a belief, because then that expression would mean I don't know that I lack a belief. That's not what anybody means when they call themselves an agnostic atheist. What they're saying when they're an agnostic atheist is they think that there isn't a God, but they're not sure and they can't demonstrate it.
All right. I'm thinking
that position. It's just a good old agnostic.
See, I was thinking it was I don't believe and I don't know, because that's what I'm thinking. But maybe you're right. Maybe lacking belief is maybe too strong, because if there's somebody says I don't believe and I don't know, I didn't see the problem with that. Especially if you're talking about knowledge entails belief.
Yeah, if you want to separate them, that would be okay. Except that the expression agnostic atheist, the word agnostic is supposed to modify the type of atheist that you are.
Right.
Yes.
You're an agnostic atheist, right? So it's not like with one word I'm talking about one thing and the other word I'm talking about the other thing. It's an expression where one it modifies the other. That is, one elaborates upon the kind of atheist that you are, right? So that's the problem I have. I wonder if I could just touch on that last question, though. I've got to go. Could I just say a couple of words about that?
I have to too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're gonna close up after this.
Okay. So Tyler Durden's question was about burden of justification and who you're supposed to justify it to, and I agree wholeheartedly with what Bert said. First and foremost, a burden of justification is to yourself, right? You want to have a rationale that makes your belief rational. You want to have a reason for what you believe, on pain of irrationality if you can't, right? So if you don't care about having warranted, rational, justified beliefs, then fine. You don't have a burden of justification, even to yourself. Go ahead, be irrational, right? But if you like to think of yourself as a critical thinker and a rational agent, and specifically a responsible epistemological agent, that is, you are responsible in how you arrive at and maintain and update and revise your beliefs, then you ought to have reasons for what you believe, so that your epistemological responsibility is first and foremost to yourself to discharge the burden of justification for what you believe. But there's also the discursive one. When you're talking to somebody and they say, what do you think about this? What's your position on this? And you give them your reasons. People are going to, even if they agree with you, they don't have to disagree with you to ask, well, why do you think that's true? Right? This is one of the most maddening things that happens in discussions between theists and atheists, that Bert mentioned. You're talking to a theist and you express your incredulity about what they believe, and they assume that if you ask for a justification, it can only be because you're affirming the opposite position. You might not be, right? You could also be a theist and want to know why another theist believes what they believe. I ask my fellow atheists all the time, why do you think there's no God? And then they go, well, what reason is there for thinking there's a God? Confusing me with a theist. I just want to know why you think there's no God. I happen to think there's no God either, but I've got reasons, right? So you have you don't need another person in the room to have a burden of justification. The burden of justification is conferred upon you as a condition of rationality on your part, right? And the specific burden is dictated by what you believe and the degree of confidence with which you hold it, right? If you believe something rather weakly, guardedly, then obviously you don't need as much reason to believe it so weakly. But if you believe something very, very adamantly and strenuously and vociferously, you better have better reasons for it, right? So there's two ways to be rational. One is believing something without any good reason, but the other is having reasons, but having your confidence completely out of step and not scaling with the quality and quantity of the evidence. So that's why. So there's a discursive burden of justification. People reasonably are going to want to know why you think what you think to the extent that you think it. But also, the first and foremost, you have a burden to yourself. You don't need anybody else in the room to have a burden of justification.
Well said. Well said. Because we've actually seen some of our theist counterparts insist that someone else try to refute their position in order to forward their, whatever their position may or may not be. So on that note, folks, we're going to have to close it out. Thank you, our three honorary Black heathens.
Hey, by the way, the name of the show tonight was 3 Black Heathens and 3 White Anti-God People. Yeah,
close enough. Close enough.
Three white apostates. How about that? 3 Black Heathens and the 3 white apostates. How about that?
All right. So if y'all want to be on the show, I see we have some new fans. Cafe, or I'm not sure how you pronounce your name. I've heard about you. If you want to come on and express whatever it is that you believe at this current time, there's always next week. We did not get to your questions this time. Sorry, it's late. Folks have lives. So we will be back. Nate has hangouts throughout the week sometimes that are open. I may, after I get done with finals and, who knows, in between promoting, may get in some time to address some stuff. So that being said, folks, we thank you. We thank our guests. And, hey, have a good night, folks.